Good afternoon and welcome to the World of Work webinar series sponsored by CARO, the Cornell Industrial Labor Relations School's Center for Applied Research on Work. This series is designed to leverage applied research conducted at the ILR school and partner institutions with the goal of informing policy and practice related to work, labor, and employment. My name is Ann DeCecco. I'm a Senior Research and Policy Development Associate at CARO, and I'm very pleased to open up today's webinar, Best Practices to Support Neurodiversity in the Workplace. Today's webinar features our partners here at Cornell, the ILR School's K. Lisa Yang and Hock E. Tan Institute on Employment and Disability, and the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, as well as the organization Neurodiversity in the Workplace. We have an exciting and important topic to dive into, so I won't take up too much time. Studies show that somewhere around 15 to 20% of the world's population is neurodivergent. When thought about from an employment perspective, that is a significant potential source of talent, and we all stand to benefit from making workplaces more inclusive and accessible for people who identify as neurodivergent. So today we've brought together experts in this topic to discuss some of their latest research and promising practices that help us answer the question, how can we make workplaces work better for those of us and our colleagues who are neurodivergent? Before we get started, I want to acknowledge Lisa Yang for her generous support of CARO and CARO's Yang Tan Workability Incubator, without which much of the important work we do would not be possible. And in particular, this whole area of research at Cornell University related to employment outcomes for people with disabilities and people who identify as neurodivergent has been shaped and influenced by Lisa's vision. We know she's joining today and want to express our gratitude to her. Lisa, thank you. And now I want to give a very big thanks to our distinguished speakers today and introduce them. First, Dr. Katie Brenly-Brown, an Extension Associate for the Yang Tan Institute at Cornell's ILR School. Her research centers around promoting positive transition outcomes for youth with intellectual and developmental disabilities. She's a researcher for Project ATTAIN, which stands for Autism Transition to Adulthood Initiative. She's also a program evaluator for Oregon Vocational Rehabilitation's demonstration project, the Inclusive Career Advancement Program. In addition, she's an associate in the Technical Assistance Partnership for Data within the New York State Office of Special Education's Partnership. Dr. Suzanne Bruyere is the academic director of the Yang Tan Institute and a professor of disability studies at Cornell. As academic director, she is responsible for the strategic and financial direction of the research, training, technical assistance, and information dissemination for the Institute. She's the PI and project director of the National Policy, Research, and Technical Assistance Center on Employment of People with Disabilities, which is funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy. She's the author and co-author of 5 books and over 180 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters on workplace disability inclusion. Next, Dr. Kirsty Lauder is a postdoctoral associate working on the Lab Inclusion for Everyone project, also called LIFE, which aims to support the Cornell Lab in becoming more inclusive for students and staff who are neurodivergent. She's an organizational psychologist by training, and her research has previously focused on accommodations for people with ADHD. She's a neurodiversity advocate, identifies as neurodivergent herself, and is passionate about creating inclusive workplaces for all by adopting systemic and evidence-based approaches. And last but not least, Joseph Riddle is the director of Neurodiversity in the Workplace, a consultancy that assists businesses across the US and the globe in diversifying their workforces through the inclusion of autistic and other neurodivergent talents. Through his work, he cultivates partnerships with businesses and guides his team in designing and implementing hiring programs for neurodivergent individuals. An advocate for systems change, Joe holds a BS in psychology and a master's of public health from George Washington University, and has been working with neurodivergent individuals in the corporate world for the last 8 years. Before we begin, I want to encourage you all to be active participants and enter questions as we go along in the Q&A box. We'll save some time at the end to make sure we can address as many as we can. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Katie Brenly-Brown. Katie?
Great. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending upon where you're joining us from. My name is Dr. Katie Brenly-Brown, as Ann had mentioned, and I'm going to talk briefly about effective practices and predictors for transition-aged youth with autism. And when I'm talking about transition, the one that I'm referring to is that movement from high school to life after high school, also known as the post-secondary transition. Okay, great. So before I dive into the presentation, I want to acknowledge the diverse perspectives in autism-related terminology as it's been emphasized in prior research. So there are many autistic individuals who prefer to use identity-first language because autism is considered to be a part of their identity. And on the other hand, person-first language, which places the person before an identifier to enhance their humanity, adheres to person-centered practices and also the social model of disability. So I will be using both identity-first and person-first language in my presentation when referring to people with autism. More broadly, I know that my colleagues will be discussing implications for their work for the neurodivergent community, which includes autism spectrum disorder, but also includes populations with other differences. There are a few examples on this slide here, including ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Tourette syndrome, etc. And when thinking of neurodiversity, we can define it as a concept in which these neurological differences, a few of which I just mentioned, are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. So difference does not equate to deficit. And rather we celebrate the idea that there is no one right way of thinking, there's no one right way of learning or interacting with the world around us. Now, autism spectrum disorder has been defined as a neurodevelopmental disability. So it's characterized by persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, and the presence of restrictive, repetitive patterns in behavior, interests, or activities. So autistic disorder, it's classified in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is a reference published by the American Psychiatric Association. As having 6 or more symptoms from a list of 12 possible symptoms that are grouped into 3 overarching areas, which are shared on this slide here, including social interaction, communication, and behavior. Most importantly, we want to reiterate that there are no 2 people with autism who are the same. At this time, I'd like to introduce one of the projects that I'm working on and which Anne previously mentioned, and that's Project Attain, which stands for the Autism Transition to Adulthood Initiative. This project is led by Dr. Leslie Shaw. She's our principal investigator. And the purpose of Project Attain is to improve post-secondary outcomes for young adults with autism through identifying predictors of obtaining a job, pursuing college or university, or living independently after high school. And then most recently, as part of this project, we've incorporated the second component where I will be training and coaching pre-service teachers, which are those teachers that are entering the workforce, on the implementation of a transition practice to determine its effectiveness for youth with autism. If you have your phones readily available, you can hold it up to the screen here to the QR code, which will link you directly to our website, which is also listed on this slide as autismtransitiontoadulthood.org. Okay, so why does our research with Project Attain particularly focus on autistic youth? And that's because approximately 42% in their early 20s have never held paid employment. And that is a rate that's higher than many other disability categories. In general, autistic adults experience high rates of unemployment and underemployment. And autistic adults are particularly at high risk of not participating in employment the first few years after high school exit. Furthermore, navigating the various systems after secondary education is a particular challenge for many transition-aged youth with disabilities, including many youth with autism who formerly received supports and services under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So unlike in secondary education, where these transition-age youth receive academic instruction and those needed related services in school settings, transition-age youth and their families at the post-secondary level, they have to navigate so many different supports and services offered by a variety of organizations and agencies. And for these reasons, among others, the post-secondary transition, it's often considered one of the most difficult transitions in a person's lifetime. So this is why researchers have taken an interest in predictors. Predictors are those experiences that occur in school that are linked to improved outcomes after high school. So predictors in particular, they are recommended to be embedded within transition programs at that systems level. And there are 23 of which that are associated with one or more of the outcomes that I've provided on this slide, including employment, post-secondary education and training, and independent living. And we know that there are many other experiences that a person can have after high school, but these are the 3 outcome areas that are the most commonly researched. And these predictors are for youth with disabilities more generally, where 21 of which are associated with post-school employment. So I'm going to share what these predictors look like. So we've grouped the predictors into 4 areas in line with work that's come out of the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the Collaborative, otherwise known as NTAC-C. So we have policy predictors, career development predictors, student skills predictors, and collaborative systems. So similar to effective practices, which I'm going to talk about a little later in my presentation, predictors have varying levels of supportive evidence, from the evidence-based to the research-based and to the promising level, where the evidence-based has the most amount of supportive literature. So I just want to share a few examples for the sake of time of what this could look like. So youth who are included in general education, that is associated with experiencing employment, post-secondary education, and independent living at that research-based level. Career technical education, also formerly known as vocational education, that is an evidence-based predictor for employment and a research-based predictor for education. And then one more example, youth autonomy and decision-making, that is a promising predictor of independent living and a research-based predictor for education and employment. So we see an increasing number of people with autism being diagnosed each year, and overwhelmingly poor post-school outcomes experienced by many people in this population. So we see multiple different stakeholder groups who have taken a greater interest in understanding which experiences predict different outcomes after high school. And yet they're, in spite of this research literature growing, it's little is known about the extent to which these experiences predict different outcomes for that subpopulation of youth with autism. And that is largely because the literature previously has largely lacked including youth with autism in their study samples, either if they were in the samples among other disabilities, or maybe not included whatsoever in those studies previously, although we have seen an increase in the literature in most recent years. So with Project Attain, we first wanted to know whether or not the known predictors of successful transition to adulthood for youth with disabilities also apply to youth with autism. And this is overarchingly what we found. So this table here is a modified and updated table from a previous study conducted by Dr. David Test and his colleagues in 2020, where they looked at predictors of different outcome areas, including employment, education, and independent living. And in particular, they selected studies that included or exclusively targeted youth with autism in their study samples. So the X's that are in the color black, they were identified in that review previously by Dr. Test. And the red X's share an update to the literature based off of Project Attain findings. So just to share a few examples, we found that having community experiences in high school is a predictor of employment and education after high school. And as another example, self-realization predicts employment after high school as well. So very quickly, before I move on to effective practices, I wanted to share a few example findings related to predictors of current employment outcomes based on analyses that we conducted using a nationally representative survey that we had developed as part of the 3rd year of Project Attain. So these results here are reported in odds. So if we think about odds, we can think of flipping a coin, heads or tails, where we have even odds of flipping that coin. And odds that are greater than 1 mean that there's a higher chance of success. and odds less than 1 means that there is less of a chance for success. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to share a few examples. So autistic individuals who worked for pay while in high school had over 3 times greater odds of having later employment compared to those who did not work for pay in high school. In particular, those who had out-of-school jobs had over 7 times greater odds of having that current employment compared to those who didn't while they were in high school. And then one more example just to share, youth with autism who participated in resume writing during high school had about 2.5 greater odds of having current employment compared to those who did not participate in resume writing during high school. So now that we have some familiarity with predictors, we can use this knowledge to help us to determine different effective practices for different areas of need. So I provided a definition here of effective practices, which essentially provide educators with teaching methods shown to be successful at enhancing specific skills for specific populations in specific contexts, and which can support the development and acquisition of student IEP, individualized education program goals and objectives. So there are 64 known effective practices, and rather than list all 64 on this slide here, I did just provide a link to those effective practices and their operational definitions according to the literature, which I'm happy to share this slide deck after the presentation. And I also provided a few example effective practices that were shown to be effective for youth with autism, among other disabilities, and which targeted specific skills related to employment. So just to share 1 or 2 examples from this slide here, the FEAT curriculum, Family Employment Awareness Training, that's essentially designed to help families and professionals and people with individual support needs to develop high expectations for competitive integrated employment and to gain knowledge about employment services, supports, and resources. One more example, there's Project Search, which is a school to work transition model with rotating internships for a school year. So just to recap the differences between effective practices and predictors, the effective practices, they occur in the classroom with the students. So that they are those intervention and strategies that you implement with students to help them gain specific skills. And then we have predictors that are at that systems level, and they are used to help evaluate and also develop and implement transition programs. We identify practices through experimental and intervention research, and we identify predictors through correlational research. And just to share an example between the two, I've provided predictors on the left-hand side, all related to self-determination. So self-determination is essentially acting as the causal agent in one's life. It's taking control of one's life or engaging in actions to do so, such as setting goals for yourself, making choices, advocating for your needs. And so 5 predictors relate to self-determination. And in our ATTAIN findings, we found that all 5 of these predictors are associated with all 3 of the most commonly researched outcome areas of employment, education, and independent living. So a practice that you can implement with students in the classroom, an example here is the self-determination learning model of instruction, which teaches students how to be more self-determined and how to, in particular, set goals for themselves. So this is an evidence-based practice, and this is evidence-based for youth with intellectual disability, emotional behavioral disturbance, and youth with specific learning disability. And so there's not enough research yet to determine its effectiveness for youth with autism. And that brings us to our next steps for Project ATTAIN. So we're very excited that we'll be implementing a pilot study where we will be instructing and coaching 2 teachers entering the workforce on how to implement the self-determination learning model of instruction to determine its effectiveness for youth with autism, particularly those who are transitioning out of high school. And we hope to address the multiple research questions that we have on this slide. And of course, we will be implementing this of spring of next year. So if you're interested in learning about our findings, please stay in tune with our research, which we'll update on our website. So I just want to recap those three takeaways from this presentation. And most importantly, transition education, services, and programs, it needs to be informed by and grounded in high quality research. And in particular, it's important that we have practitioners who have knowledge of both effective practices that teach those student level skills and also predictors that they can embed in their transition programs that can help increase the likelihood of youth with autism and other disabilities experiencing different outcomes after high school. So when you get access to these slides, you'll see a bunch of resources that we have here, many of which are also provided on the Attain website. Another great resource is NTACHC, which I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. And then for further literature, if you're interested in transition and predictors and practices, the big names that you'll want to look out for include Valerie Mazzotti, David Test, and Dawn Rowe, which I provided a few of their research articles here. But thank you so much for your time. My email is here. You're welcome to contact me if you have any questions that don't get answered today in the presentation. And we also have a social media accounts for our Project Attain, and we really hope that you do follow us. And at this time, I'm going to stop my share and pass it on to our next presenter, who is going to talk about the hiring process for youth with autism, Dr. Briere.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thanks to my Caro colleagues for supporting interest and an opportunity to present information about this topic that we believe all of us here is critically important. My name is Suzanne Briere, and as you heard, I am with the Yang Tan Institute on Employment and Disability, and also must give thanks to Lisa Yang, who 10 years ago encouraged us to pursue research and consultation with employers around this topic, and it has certainly informed our efforts over these 10 years for sure. So as we get started here, we each have sponsors who have supported us in this work, and I must acknowledge that in the last 5 years, we have pursued partnerships that have allowed us to have National Science Foundation research. And indeed, the research I'm sharing with you today was funded by partnership with Vanderbilt University. We have a contract over 2 waves of NSF funding supported by Vanderbilt's leadership on a project entitled Empowering Neurodiverse Populations for Employment Through Inclusion AI and Innovation Science. And our colleagues on that was Tim Bogus from Vanderbilt University and our own internal colleagues, Vicki Chang and Matt Sala. And we are now joined by Katie Brindley-Brown in future research on this. And Vicki now is with the Social Research and Demonstration Corporation in Vancouver, BC. So we want to give due accolades and recognition to those colleagues. So in the time I have with you, some of the things I'm going to hit on, and then we certainly can come back to in the Q&A, is why a focus on the interview process is important. That is where we have targeted our focus for this particular research. I'll talk a bit about what we did in that research, but most importantly, I think to the utility of the hour we're spending with you, or 90 minutes, ways to improve that process for neurodiverse job candidates in terms of the employer's role, what job applicants themselves can do, and how those in a supportive position, whether community service providers or career counselors, in the secondary education process, can do to support individuals to be more successful and get that job. And then each of us will be sharing resources. I also come to the table with some resources for you for your future reference. So why a focus on autistic job seekers? We did very narrowly focused. We have narrowly focused on autistic job seekers, certainly some who also identify with other neurodivergent characteristics from that umbrella list that Dr. Brindley-Brown shared with you. But our focus was more narrowly focused in our approach. And that is because of some of the concerns that Katie shared with you. The statistics suggest that this is a population that could use our attention. There have been historically higher levels of unemployment, that should be an underemployment, than both people without disabilities in the general population, but also people with other types of disabilities. So it definitely should be an area of our focus, we feel, those of us who are in the employment and disability advocacy and research area. There are disabilities in employment, even for autistic individuals who have above average education and qualifications to the rest of the workforce. They report to us themselves in their employment process pursuits, and employers tell us that there is heightened concerns about people not making it through the interview process and into employment successfully in greater proportion than the general population. And we do know from our consultation, even prior to this research, but certainly within the umbrella of this research, that many report, both individuals, employers, and those who are supporting individuals with autism, difficulty with the employment interview process, which remains the most widely used hiring selection approach, and therefore one that we really need to try to inform with greater information empirically derived about what's the problem and how can we remediate that. So why focus on the interview process? Traditional employment processes and interviewing have often presented barriers to autistic individuals. We know that employers have historically not been aware of these barriers and need assistance in changing their protocols. Many employers were not aware how many candidates that they were losing in the screening and interview process historically. Autistic individuals have not necessarily been well equipped to navigate this process in their preparation for seeking employment, and many service providers, including career counselors, have not known how to mitigate these issues. And there are cost and time efficient and effective measures are needed and available if we look more closely and scrutinize this process for where the barriers present themselves. So in response to what we know as barriers, our research has aimed to understand the perception of employers, service providers, and that's community service providers providing direct support. And I think our colleague Joseph Riddle will give you more information about what that can look like in the positive end of things. Educational institution representatives in interviewing or interacting with autistic individuals socially in the workplace, and explore the lived experience of autistic individuals in that interview process, and also to some extent in interview interactions when they do get into the employment setting. We targeted specific individuals, so I think it's important for us to share who our informants were, our participant characteristics in this research. We looked for autistic individuals who were working age, had interview experience, and those that have customer-facing jobs. We did have some questions about their interaction once they got into the workplace, if they had interface with the public. Our employers, we wanted autism at work hiring program people who had actual experience they could speak to in interviewing autistic individuals, and experience in supervising those in customer-facing positions. We looked at educational institutions, in my rapidity with advancing things, career counselors, and those specifically who had experience in supporting those with job interviewing skills and had identified with autism, and community organizations that were serving autistic individuals, providing coaching, interviewing, and customer service skills preparation of autistic individuals. Our methodology were semi-structured individual and focus group interviews. We did some preliminary field testing of these items to make sure that people, cognitive testing, understood our items and helped refine them for us. We had 23 individuals in this initial study. We've done further work since that time, but I won't be going into that. We did a content analysis to capture the key themes and triangulated that with inter-rater reliability to establish agreement. And in this process, we identified barriers to and facilitators of successfully navigating the interview process to obtain employment. So with that process, we identified barriers in the job interview process and in the interview environment. And here is what we learned. The types of questions asked are problematic often in this process, and many employers use this process broadly. It has been considered a best practice to use open-ended hypothetical questions that paint a personality profile of the individual. And these are problematic, particularly for individuals with autistic characteristics. Similarly, the interview structure, which has been traditionally used, can be very difficult to navigate. And that has been historically using large group panels of people, up to 5 or 6 people who ask questions. It can be also, they may be less numbers of people, but there's multiple sequential interviews of at least 1 or 2 people that can be a day or more than 1 day long. And these can be very anxiety producing for anyone, but particularly a person with autistic characteristics. Also problematic, again, problematic for any of us, but for this population, we're reportedly can be very disruptive. Environments that are noisy, have noxious smells, have certain kinds of lighting or a lot of stimulation in that environment, problematic. And recruiters, interviews, and hiring managers being rarely aware of affirmative hiring or being trained to affirmatively support people in the interaction process, in the interview process. So we found barriers for autistic job seekers, little prior experience in job interviews, and you heard from Dr. Brenly Brown, and we can confirm this preparation process is very important. They had prior work experience, we've heard is important. Lack of familiarity with work settings in general, but particularly the ones they were interviewing for, and they were challenged in addressing what were perceived to be ambiguous questions, difficulty explaining how their skills address job requirements. They might have felt awkward in the social interaction expectations of the interview process, and heightened anxiety if they felt that they had to camouflage or fake some of their mannerisms that were artistic characteristics, or needed to fake socially appropriate responses. So we learned from this that employers can step in and assist with how they frame their interview process, giving hiring managers and interviewing professionals some training about how the way they approach the process and the questioning process is problematic, and modifying that or replacing existing interview protocols, very important. Examples with specificity can be providing interview questions in advance to the interviewee, allowing them to get some exposure to the work environment as an icebreaker, having less problematic panels, 1-on-1 or 2-on-1 interview settings, lessening the rapid fire approach to the questioning process, eliminating vague or open-ended questions, and allowing individuals to present their technical skills rather than having to describe them verbally. Very helpful. And career counselors and community service providers can definitely be of assistance in working with employers or recruiters to build their knowledge of neurodiversity and explore a willingness to alter the traditional interview process, as well as helping to gain questions, a set of typical questions that they can prep people with, and exploring with employers' portfolio and demonstrating skills, types of approaches, rather than verbal interaction solely about the skills the person has, and helping to get preparation exposure in advance with internships and work experiences. Applicants can better prepare, and they can do this with pre-interview preparation, learning how to present their skills and demonstrating their skills, social interface preparation, and building advocacy skills. As my colleague talked about, Katie had mentioned this for sure. One of the things I will say, I want to acknowledge, since I have focused on the interview process, that neurodiversity workplace inclusion is across the whole continuum. That is important for employers to be aware of. It's not just at the front end of the process. And this schematic talks about all the places in the interview and the employment process where employers need to be aware about there are good practices that promote inclusion. And that it's important to ready the workplace across all of these different features, like getting your supervisors and getting community partnerships, using all of your internal resources, your communication mechanisms to support affirmative hiring of neurodiverse individuals, and thinking about how do you sustain these good practices over time. We at Cornell University do have programs that will support that. And in this set of slides, I talk about those online eCornell resources that we have built to support the things we've learned about our good practices. And we do leave you here with some related resources, most of which are open source online. We encourage you to go to, and I know the slides will be available for you to do so. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for your time and attention and turn this over to our colleague, Kirsty.
Thank you so much. Okay. Hi everyone, so I'm Kirsty and I'm going to talk to you today about Project Life, which is a project at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. To give some context about what the Lab of Ornithology is, it's a conservation-based organisation, and we have around 300 staff, 100 associated students, and kind of 100 extra associated staff as well. So the project itself has two main aims. The first is to improve inclusivity for neurodiverse and disabled staff and students at the lab. And the second is to create a toolkit that can be used by other departments at Cornell and other organisations. So we're hoping that we can use the lab to try and test out this toolkit, develop it further, and see what works and what doesn't. My slides are moving automatically, so I'll have to keep my talking short. Okay, so the project has three phases. We start with the neurodiversity audit, so finding out what the lab needs and what the people need at the lab. Then move to build and develop. So building and developing in response to what the lab needs. And then implementing what we've built and evaluating whether it works. And we've got this iterative process about how we'll go back to asking what people need, building and developing, implementing it and testing whether it works, and keep going round. And these phases are guided by participatory principles, which means that anything that we do is going to be informed by the people that are going to have the change happen to them. So we have an advisory group of neurodivergent staff and students who contribute to all aspects of the project. So a bit of context, we found through a survey we had about 158 respondents that 20% identified as neurodiverse. So this is in line with population estimates. And of these, if we break it down, 21 identified as having a mental health condition, 13 ADHDers, 6 autistic people, and then 5 PTSDers. But when we asked people if they experience what challenges they experience at work, 79% of the total respondents experienced these related challenges that could be associated with disability or neurodivergence. So even though people weren't identifying as such, people were experiencing the challenges at work. What else did we find? I'm going to highlight 3 of the audit changes. The first is the physical workspace, and the physical workspace itself at the lab is mostly people working in cubicles where they have their own desk space, but they're in kind of an open plan setting. And this was a barrier to productivity, but also wellness. So people reported, as mentioned earlier, sensitivity to lighting, to sound, and there was a lack of variety in types of spaces. As the labs expanded and got more people, the meeting and social spaces have reduced. The second one is a lack of knowledge. So there was a lack of knowledge about neurodiversity and accommodations, and this was especially prevalent among managers. And there was lower well-being and belonging measures for neurodivergent staff and students as well. So they reported lower on well-being and inclusion measure of belonging. So we build and develop using 5 different methods. The first is inclusive research. So adopting that participatory approach and creating a partnership between the, to kind of create a balance between the researched and the researcher, mix up that power relationship. We've collected kind of information or evidence in lots of different ways. So surveys, interviews, focus groups, anything we do, we communicate out, make sure we go through the advisory group themselves. So all our communications are run through the advisory group. And we even include the advisory group in our data analysis as well. So switching up that power so members of the advisory group can actually take part in the data analysis itself. Second, we want to focus on community, and this extends beyond the advisory group to aspects like leadership commitment, and that's more than just buy-in. We've got great buy-in from our senior leaders, but we've also got a commitment by them to attend our workshops, our special manager workshops, and to kind of focus on implementing these best practices. We've set up an affinity group for neurodivergent and disabled students and staff as well. And our advisory group is thriving. There's 20 students and staff with lived experience, and they inform, as mentioned, all aspects of the research, the training, and the recommendations we make for the environment. So third, we build and develop knowledge, because that was a gap. And we've done this through awareness trainings. So we've created awareness trainings for everybody. And this aims to increase understanding in neurodiversity more broadly. So going beyond what maybe autism, ADHD is and looking at kind of it through an intersectional lens. It's an interactive awareness training and aims to provide tools, scenarios, and a glossary after of inclusive language, for example. We've then developed a workshop that's specific for managers. It gives information on accommodations using the toolkit that's already available at Cornell. It's interactive and applied, so we go through scenarios as a group and discuss them, and also provides tools and resources. So applied in that, we give the scenario, we give the resources, and then we apply that to the scenario and have further discussions about that. And then to extend our knowledge beyond just increasing awareness and kind of carry on the conversation, we've got a series of community discussions and town halls that happen at the lab. And we invite guest speakers to come in, so you get a range of different experiences there. We've also developed a set of best practices, or we're midway through developing these. We have meetings, events, but then we're going to focus on hiring and recruitment, then onboarding, and part of the performance assessment as well. So these are best practice guidelines that are based on neuro-inclusive practices. We then turn to the environment, as that was a barrier for students and staff. And the first thing we did was to create a recharge room, or what's commonly known as a sensory room. And this room aims to provide a variety in sensory soothing and sensory seeking experiences. So we've got the rocking chair for movement, we've got a relaxing lounger, we've got lots of puzzles, mindfulness suggestions. Lots of people at the lab experience migraines, so we've got hot and cold presses. I mean, it's just a space where people can go to recharge for 30 minutes and then go back to their work. Ideally, moving forward, we would look to building on the concept of universal design, where you have different spaces in the workplace for different things. So some things for community building, some focus on communication, so working together in teams, and some for silent private working. And how we're kind of trying to move forward with this is move beyond what at the moment where people are grouped or sat in their departments. So what we find at the lab is there's lots of different temperatures, different areas of different temperatures, different lighting. So some offices have natural light, some don't, and some are darker. And it's about having that autonomy to move between these different areas. So some achievements so far. So this project's been going for 2 years now. We're about to enter our 3rd year. We've had 197 Cornell staff attend at least one of the training or the manager workshops. So what we did was we tested the training within the lab, and then now we offer it out to everyone through CU Learn at Cornell. 43% of our managers at the lab have attended the manager-specific workshop, which is great. We want to improve that further. As part of the launch for our meeting guidelines, we have put tactile boxes in each meeting room, which contain things like fidget spinners, etc., like stress balls, to kind of help people's concentration. The recharge room has been designed and ready for use. It was launched yesterday, so it's very brand new. We've created the affinity group. We've had about 6 months of that running now. But more importantly, what our data is showing is that there is already a feeling, an increased feeling of belonging in neurodivergent staff. And our knowledge and familiarity with neurodiversity has increased across the organisation. So it was low and now it's increasing. However, we are noticing that the people attending these workshops and trainings are people who already know a lot about neurodiversity. So our next kind of target is to try and engage people who have lower knowledge and get them involved in the trainings. So my key learnings so far. First, building a sense of community, and this extends beyond kind of a top-down and a bottom-up approach. Commitment to learning that extends just beyond awareness trainings. It's actually what you do afterwards. What I've heard from neurodivergent staff and students is that flexibility and autonomy is important. And this is beyond just the workspace, the physical workspace. Having control over your workspace is important. Sometimes you might like bright lights, sometimes you might not. And it's about that control over your environment, but also flexibility in your environment. But also flexibility and autonomy in how you get your work done. So how you do your best work is going to differ between lots of people and differ on different days within one person. So some people, so it's kind of flexibility in communication styles, so how you might communicate differently. Some people prefer writing, some people prefer to communicate face-to-face. And flexibility in work schedules, so whether you are working later in the day or earlier in the day. So these are two things that are important. And then finally, that kind of continuous evaluation. And we've really kind of improved our trainings and workshops by always continuously evaluating and asking for feedback and then actioning that feedback. An example is we aimed to make our workshop for managers a short half day because we thought that managers have limited time. And so we wanted to respect that and give them half a day. Based on the feedback, they want a full day of learning now, so they can build and think about the resources and have deeper discussions. So we've now extended it, added some more activities in. So that's kind of how we're continuously evaluating everything that we do. So where do we want to go next? Well, this continued implementation and evaluation. And we want to continue to make changes to the physical space. We want to extend our training and workshops, offer them online, build on the community discussions. We want to build on more resources as part of the toolkit. And then our final thing, our next new step is to work with the lab's diversity, equity, inclusion and justice team on developing and implementing a mentoring or coaching program. So my practical takeaways for neuro-inclusive workplaces. A focus on flexibility and autonomy, learning about inclusion, intersectionality and neurodiversity more broadly, providing accommodation toolkits and resources of how to have those discussions, what to do, what the process is. As Suzanne mentioned, best practice guidelines that span the employee life cycle, so from hiring or even transitioning from school to college or to work, all right the way through to retirement. And then other evidence-based practices that are important. So coaching and mentoring has got the strongest evidence base so far for neurodivergent people. But lastly, my main message is everything you do should involve the neurodivergent community. And it's something that has really helped Project Life become stronger and be better in general and actually implement things that are useful to our community. So I'd like to thank my advisory group for everything that they've done and the core team and also the YTI Institute for funding the project. And I will pass over to Joe.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. and a lot of overlap here in the conversation, but really appreciate those perspectives. But so as everyone mentioned, I'm Joe Riddle from Neurodiversity in the Workplace. We are a nonprofit consultancy and service provider that partners with organizations to help create these equitable programs, to put some of them into action. And our mission is to design and really implement the work that so many people are talking about here, the research that people have spent time doing. We want to take as much of that as possible and put it into action. And recently, there's a terminology that has come out. Dr. Hala Nabi at the University of Washington published a guide here calling what we are, our organization, external neuro-inclusion partners, kind of blending this term of service provider with something that is a little bit more company facing, acknowledging that every employment relationship is really a 50-50 balance between employee or prospective employee and then employer. We have this balance that needs to occur. It's a relationship that is being formed. And so our organization focuses on both sides of that. We got our start about 10 years ago with a German software company called SAP and their Autism at Work program. And we've been spreading around how companies can create strategies and implement these strategies of support, training, understanding of systems change that can happen to allow for more and better neuro-inclusion efforts. And so these are some of our partners listed here. We have a strong focus on technology and finance, but roles and jobs in every area and industry, which is really exciting. Now, I'm going to quickly revisit some of the earlier terminology that everyone did a great job explaining, but it's just in my DNA to lead off with this to set the stage. So neurodiversity refers to the different natural variances in the brain that result in different ways of thinking, learning, socializing, experiencing the world, right? We all have different ways of thinking and learning. A super common illustration is how you like to best absorb information. Are you a visual learner? Are you an auditory processor? Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? These are all things that encompass the idea of this very broad topic of neurodiversity. Now, when we break it down further, there are different neurotypes that live within this very broad topic of neurodiversity. So we see a neurotype referring to just a type of brain that we can align a set of characteristics to. And what we really focus on, because we have so much work facing employers, is we start to shed this medical definition and instead look towards an identity and social model of disability. And so we get to this idea of neurodivergence, which is referring to neurologic function that is outside of or diverges from what society considers normal or a neurotypical neurotype. So examples of neurotypes that are neurodivergent would be ADHD, autism, Tourette's, etc. So just wanted to tie that back together as we begin this conversation here. Now, what I really wanted to talk about today is how do we start now? How do we take so much of this action that everyone has explained, and what can you do in your work today that will be beneficial? And so much of what we've learned and how we're implementing this is echoing everything that everyone said here. And one of the big things that I like to throw out is that awareness alone, it doesn't lead to an action and a solution. We need a little bit more than that. And we see in Kirsty's example here of the workshops that follow up on the learning, we see this as a common thread. But what I want to talk about very briefly here in my 15 minutes is what action steps you can take today to put those things in place. And so what I really like to frame this as really a change management conversation. And I'm defining it here as a process to implement improvements in a system through project management, objectives, and deliverables. And all of you, I see the attendee list and we got the registration list. So I see where people are coming from. A lot of you are representing some larger organizations or complex academic institutions where there's a lot of different layers to how the system works, how people implement changes. And so you can see how it takes a lot more than saying, hey, we should be doing this. It takes people getting together and actively working on that. And this is what our organization tries to help our partners do in forming the plans, forming the objectives, forming the project management to be able to get those things done. So the first one that I want to get to, an action plan for all of you, is this idea of hidden curriculum. Hidden curriculum, we are defining here as every company has its own culture, style, expectations, and employees are usually left to kind of pick this up on their own. And there are so many different examples of things that are left unsaid that are actually implied and expected in any workplace. So it's helpful to really demystify these expectations surrounding any company, any team, the culture, behavioral assumptions that go along with that. So some common examples that might need clarification are things like, how do you simply leave for lunch? Are you going to let everyone know I'm stepping out for a minute? I'll be back at X time. Or are you just going to leave and that's generally expected? This might seem like a really minor thing on your individual teams that you're working on, but it is a culture that is usually left uncommunicated. And when all of these things start to add up, things like how do you take time off? What kind of documentation and changing processes should you outline? How does your boss prefer you present information to them? Are you expected to respond to emails in X amount of time or not? All of these things are typically hidden curriculum items that are very infrequently communicated. And our organization supports hundreds of people in the corporate workforce around the world. And we see the elements that our coaches work with both managers and employees on. And so much of it is this hidden curriculum item, things that are kind of creating this anxiety because you don't know what's expected. And if you maybe struggle with social communication in any given environment, this social communication or lack thereof in these hidden curriculum items can be really frustrating for people to experience. So helping to identify how you can start to decipher these. Some other examples, a broad statement such as, please prepare for today's meeting, could be replaced with some specific concrete instructions in bullet point format, right? So things like, I would like you to prepare a 2-minute update on what you worked on this week, what tasks still need to be completed, and what you're going to be working on next week. A simple format that in a lot of team meetings is the general expectation, but very infrequently communicated. And so much of this is the manager-employee relationship, the supervisor to team. We see so many disconnects here when those expectations are not clearly communicated. And if we can just take some time to be able to clarify those hidden curricula items, we can get to a point where we lower anxiety and help people feel a little bit more comfortable in their environments. Another really common example here is this is a fictionalized org chart. And I like to point out that hierarchy and the social relationships and social constructs that go into any kind of organization really make up a large part of how you interact with that organization, how the employees interact. And so a common thing, a common disconnect that we see, and I want you to kind of reflect on this in your own organizations that you represent here today, what these conflicting organizations and lack of clarity as to what the expectations with that hierarchy create, what kind of anxieties they can create in people. So an example here is we have this fictional president who values punctuality and scheduling and is kind of making the trains run on time and is less concerned with creativity and flexibility. Maybe in this fictional org structure, they run a very regimented industry where these things are really valuable. However, oftentimes we find that there's conflictions within the own rank of an organization. And so we see the chief executive officer reporting into the president might have opposite values, valuing creativity and flexibility and scheduling and punctuality. This is some simple organizational dynamic understanding that we see is often conflicting from team members, from leaders, and then to employees. And helping to clarify what those values are, what that interaction can be within an organization, we find really reduces the tension that pops up. And making sure that we have the time to spend to look at what is your value, what is your expectation, and making sure we understand that, especially within this often very complicated social hierarchy that exists within any organizational structure. So, action steps and challenge to all of you in this item on hidden curriculum. In your next team meeting, I assume that most people have some conversation with their teams on a regular basis or a semi-regular basis. What I challenge people to do is take 10 to 15 minutes out of the next team meeting to understand and kind of investigate as a team what the hidden curriculum items, what the hidden expectations are that create your team dynamics. And you can do it in, considering what is conveyed both indirectly through inferences and assumptions, and then consider expectations of guidelines, attitudes, behavior, terminology. One thing that we find really common is that an alignment on terminology can really create a lot of different frustrations within any kind of structure and reporting team or team that's reporting into a leader. Making sure that people understand what terminology you want things to be represented in, or what format is a better way to illustrate it. Oftentimes, we see that task lists that are distributed by leaders are communicated with a prioritization that is often very unclear. This is a hidden curriculum item as well. If I, as a leader, say we need to accomplish these 3 tasks, but don't explicitly list which one is most important to me, there starts to build frustration and resentment from leader to team member as to why aren't you working on the thing that is most important to me? So taking the time as a team to look through some of these things can be really beneficial and prevent a lot of problems before they occur. And so things, by extension, are looking at different ways of thinking, learning, socializing, experiencing the world, our definition of neurodiversity, and looking at each person's preferred communication style. This is another hidden curriculum item that can be really disruptive. If I myself, for project updates, prefer one style of communication, maybe I prefer an email with a bulleted list, but someone else, that's not information that they're going to best absorb. Maybe they best absorb it in a format like this, where there's a visual and an auditory information coming at you and you can absorb that. Understanding that from your own team can help prevent a lot of miscommunication. And so much of what we do here is preventing that miscommunication, helping people to communicate what is important to them, whether it's through the interview process and saying, here's what I can do through a skill-based hiring process, as Suzanne mentioned, or whether it's through any daily operational ideas and tasks, making sure here's what I am absorbing, here's what I'm getting back are in alignment. So things like instructions, project updates, preferred communications, the different modes that go into those communication styles, really important to be able to understand and process. Now, that's my task to all of you. Please remember it on your next team meeting. Spend 15 minutes understanding what people's preferred communication styles are. This is some simple action without a formal engagement or project management plan that you can do today that will help your teams just function better. Now, I wanted to also give an idea of the landscape of what companies are doing in this space. One of the things that we see is 4 different areas. One is strategy. So we're working with companies, and there are other external neuroinclusion partners that work with companies to look at the changes to mainstream practices, that change management I mentioned, that allow for natural inclusion, and things that others here have already pointed to, altering the interview process. We help companies to create interview structures that allow candidates to demonstrate their skills versus verbally explain them. And there's a big difference when you allow candidates to say, here's a portfolio that I've prepared and rehearsed, and I will explain it to you how I've prepared and rehearsed, versus broad open-ended questions. So we help do that, but not just for interviews, also for all types of things. Performance management is a big area where we as companies, as organizations around the world, can work to change. If we're evaluating people in the interview process in an altered way, we have to evaluate people in their daily roles and year over year in an altered way as well, making sure that it's not neurotypical standards that we're following in that evaluation process. And also allowing for what a lot of our strategy work entails, and that companies are working on, many of our partners we listed, is making sure that the support systems that naturally exist within an organization are compatible with some of the support systems that we've outlined here, like executive functioning, coaching, etc. We want to make sure that the natural supports of the organization can work together with those organizations that are external. The next one, as we mentioned, hiring specifically. Companies are working on hiring programs. We see like SAP's Autism at Work program, Dell's Neurodiversity hiring program, Walgreens, CVS. A lot of companies have these programs where they directly target neurodivergent individuals through a organized, concerted effort to adapt those processes that involve the hiring, their hiring teams. Next, coaching and support is something that companies are always working on, making sure that we can build out and understand how external providers of that support, like I mentioned, can become internal and work with internal processes. A lot of what we do here is involving this last bullet here of training, making sure that we can train internal HR business partners or HR team members or employee relations team members on how they can best support people through this process. There's a lot of organized change management that goes into it. And again, the challenge that I like organizations to take away from all of these things that companies are doing is to really understand that this is both a employer-focused effort and an employee-focused effort or prospective employee. It's a 50-50 relationship that goes into all of this. And so we can't just say we're going to provide support to job seekers that are coming through this process. We have to also look at how we can adapt our systems. As Suzanne mentioned, the whole life cycle of an employee, she had a great graph that illustrated all of the different areas. We need to tie it all together. And again, my challenge to all of you is to take some direct action in a team meeting, understanding your own hidden curriculum, but then taking it a step further and making sure that you can form concerted efforts within your own organizations, make a plan, make some objectives and deliverables as part of that plan to formalize the change management that come out of these awareness building conversations, these trainings that you can get. So anyway, thank you all. I appreciate the ILR School and Caro and Lisa Yang and all of my colleagues here on the call for allowing me to speak on this topic, but please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments. And I'll turn it back over to Anne.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate each of you taking your research findings and best practices and kind of breaking them down so that we can really understand how to apply them in our workplaces. So we'll take some time now for some questions and answers. If you have a question in the audience and you'd like to have us field it, you can put it in the Q&A box. I'll start with Katie, if you maybe could field this one, and then if anyone else wants to jump in. What can employers do to support transition-aged and post-secondary youth?
It's a great question. So, education and business partnerships are critical in helping students prepare for the workforce. So, in my presentation, I talked about those predictors of positive post-school outcomes, and there are many that are specifically correlated with employment. And a few examples are career awareness, paid employment and work experience, occupational courses, etc. But when we think about each of those predictors, they also have related characteristics. So, for example, career awareness, it includes a school-wide, comprehensive, and a systematic approach to teaching or helping students learn about different careers. So example ways you could do that are students can participate in job shadowing. They can have guest speakers come to the school from different organizations and businesses. They can participate in industry tours. They can participate in career and technical education. So what employers can do on the flip side is offer opportunities for job shadowing. Reach out to school personnel to provide to see if they need guest speakers, attend career fairs and talk about your organization. And that also brings more awareness to your organization. It also can help, move that, be involved in that talent pipeline that's coming through out of high school or also college. And also it can help organizations in focusing on becoming more diverse and inclusive. Another example that I had mentioned, the predictor of paid or unpaid work experience. So employers can provide that work experience through, part-time employment. There can also be paid or unpaid internships. And the predictor literature is mainly for secondary students, but many of these examples that I just provided could also be implemented at that post-secondary level, where organizations and businesses, they can offer internships to college students. They can offer those job shadowing experiences and industry tours and etc. I hope that answers the question, Anne.
Thanks. Yeah, I really like how you highlight that that kind of outreach can be beneficial for both sides, both the company and the applicants or youth. And it's really both sides benefiting there. Um, this next one, I guess I'll ask Suzanne to field first. If you could speak to what can employers do to retain people with autism?
Oh, that's a great question. I think some of the things, certainly many of the things that we do to retain other talent as well. Let me just start with that and say, giving regular feedback to people and helping them to understand. I think Joe talked a bit about this, giving people an opportunity to say what's working and not working with frequency, not a once a year annual review that's a surprise to some people. They have not learned in advance of that there may be something that they could be doing better. So regular meetings with people, giving them honest feedback, but also listening to them about what's working and not working for them to help support them in their performance. People want to do well, and I think giving them an opportunity to articulate what it will take to help support them to be productive at their best is terrific. And then thinking about universal design. Kirsty gave us some great examples of how we can think more broadly about how we design workplaces that minimize things that are potential impediments to people's success. Environments that are too noisy or to have light that is not good for us, in some cases just not good, or just too bright, or noxious in other ways. It's really important for us to think about those health-inducing characteristics of a workplace that we all benefit from, but people who may have certain characteristics may be better advantaged even with being able to perform in that way. And equitably giving people an opportunity to advance. I think too often we think if people have perceived limitations by supervisors, we may not afford them some of the growth opportunities we afford other people, and unnecessarily limit their ability to advance. So I think being, as supervisors, really sure that we ask people what their interests are, what they'd like to learn and do for the longer term, and giving them opportunity to take continuing education, to get stretch assignments in equitable ways that we do for the general workforce, I think it is really important. And I'll stop there. There's certainly other things, but that, I think, is a start to get people thinking.
That's great. Thanks, Suzanne. And others, all feel free to jump in if there's more to add on that one. Okay, hearing that there isn't, I will go on to another one. Kirsty, if you wouldn't mind fielding this. What should an employee do if they are not getting an accommodation that they need? What can people do at their workplace to speak up?
Okay, that is a good question, and often I don't want to make it more complicated, but it depends on the person and their workplace. But I think it's maybe about having a conversation that's not focused purely on accommodations, but more about how you do your best work. Like Suzanne just mentioned, it's about being adaptable, and we want people to be productive and well. We know that when people are well, they're more productive. So we have a thing as part of Project Life. It's called the Life Profile, and people talk about what makes their best work, and it's kind of asking for accommodation and support, but indirectly. So things like, I'm most productive when I do X, Y, and Z. The best way to learn something new is, like as Joe was mentioning, visual, audio, and video. Best way to give feedback, some people prefer feedback in different ways, and communication, and things like how you can feel included at work as well. So it's kind of building around that conversation about how you do your best work and asking for it that way, rather than often it's safer to do that rather than disclosing straight away. We found that sometimes helps, and just starting conversations about accommodations as well.
Yeah, and if I could add on to that, I think that one of the things that we see this dialogue of accommodations can often trigger this very legal definition in our mind. And that it's good. We want that. We want the ADA to have its benefits and protect people with disabilities. However, and I'll do a quick illustration that was unplanned here, so I apologize. But when we look at an accommodation, there is still a power dynamic that is at play here. An accommodation is an ask up. So an employee has to say, hey, I am one disclosing something that is oftentimes stigmatized, a disability in the workplace, and a need associated with that. And you're requesting something from the employer. Whereas what I challenge employers to do is look at it, and much to what Kirsty was saying, look at it in terms of a universal design and accessibility, a benefit. There are some simple things that we can do, like sensory needs and more explicit communication styles that we can encourage people to do, to offer down. This goes with the power dynamic, and it helps employees to receive that benefit that then removes a lot of the unnecessary paperwork and complications that go with an official accommodation legalized request, right? And so I think what a lot of companies are starting to understand is that when we can shift that dynamic and go with taking some of the just general accessibility issues and put it into benefits, put it into standard practices, we eliminate the need for a lot of the very basic accommodations that people are requesting. Our previous most commonly requested thing for employees was the use of noise canceling headphones. That's no longer the most commonly requested thing because companies now say, hey, if you're sitting in a cubicle environment and there's a lot of people around you, feel free to use noise canceling headphones. It's no longer an accommodation request in a lot of organizations. And the more we can standardize things like that to be widely available, the better we can have accommodations focusing on some more creative implementations of support needs.
And Joe's
Yes,
reminded me of
please.
something I want to add, please, too. And that is another piece of our research looked at census data from the CPS supplement. And we found there was a question on there, which isn't always on the census data, about did you ask for an accommodation and did you get it? And what we saw in that work is that 95% of accommodations are coming from people to their employers who are not people with disabilities. And employers seem to forget that. They seem to forget that they're accommodating their workforce all the time to keep them whole and productive. And there's something about when it comes attached to a disability that it makes it special. Like, several of my colleagues, Kirsty and Joe, pointed to that universal design that Joe just showed that schematic about is exactly the headset that will make people more likely to feel comfortable coming forward. Anybody, not just a person with a disability, but we should be able to do our best work by having the tools and supports we need. And so making that a part of the culture is critically important, and it will help people with disabilities come forward comfortably without having to flag it something special. It's really important.
And if I could also just add to the conversation that's already been happening, just pulling it back towards that transition process again, where self-determination and self-advocacy, they are predictors for youth with autism of getting a job, of going to college, and of living on your own after high school. So teaching those skills related to self-determination and self-advocacy is critical, because when you're in secondary education, you have people advocating for you. But when you leave high school, you need to advocate for yourself and advocate for your needs. And so there are some researchers that say transition starts at birth. And so starting early and helping students, if you're a practitioner, if you're a family member, helping teach them those skills to advocate for their own needs.
Thank you all. Yeah, I love that. I think it's really true. Whoever you are, you can learn to self-advocate. We can always stand to learn and improve in that. And then also in the workplace, stand to normalize and understand what it is that will make the workplace better for everyone. We've talked a lot about neurodiversity and sort of looking at employees, the employee side. What about leadership and people who are neurodiverse in leadership positions? Are we seeing more of a culture change to support and encourage neurodiversity in leadership in organizations? And that could be for anyone.
Yeah, I'll jump in. We're in a lot of our partnerships, we are starting to see really emerging from oftentimes employee resource groups, which are collections of people within an organization who are gathering around a topic, sort of a miniature community of practice within these larger organizations. And one of the big initiatives that we work with one organization was to identify senior leaders who identify as neurodivergent, to help spread the word and awareness and create some more action plans within the organization, that kind of change management that we're looking for. And it was a really successful endeavor to try and do that, to ask for volunteers of senior management levels to come through and start to gather together to implement change, be a part of that. And for the first time, I think that we're gaining enough awareness in this space to reduce the stigma so that senior leaders feel confident to come forward. And again, it's goes back to all of the definition of what professionalism is in the workplace and what our definition surrounding what it means to be a professional in the workplace entails. And oftentimes that's kind of in a traditional mindset, it's admit no weaknesses, right? You have no weakness, you're all strength, all innovation, etc. And that's just not a human real life view. And so when we do have leaders who are coming forward, and they are starting to, they are still the same victims of that stigma that entry-level employees are. And so we need to continue awareness to make it even more comfortable in organizations, that culture change, to allow them to come forward more. But when they do, super powerful.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I'd like to add to that. We've found when leaders make affirmative hiring of people with disabilities, and this includes neurodiverse individuals, we've seen that it's specificity, they're 5 times more likely to successfully have hired people, because that articulation really sends a message that it's an inclusive environment. And over the 10 years we've worked with companies, we've seen companies move the leadership for these affirmative hiring programs to neurodivergent individuals who have been comfortable, as Joe said, stepping forward and saying, that's me too, I'm willing to identify and want a leadership position in these programs. To the point where this week I actually had a tech company come to me and say, can you create a PhD program in leadership for neurodivergent individuals? They were interested in cultivating people with higher degrees, and looked to Cornell and the ILR school to do that. So, I mean, there's interest out there, and there's interest in helping people find a variety of ways when they're willing to come forward to enhance their ability to be leaders with the skills and knowledge that they need. I think this is the tip of the iceberg. I think we have enormous opportunity to cultivate leadership among people, and it comes with building inclusive environments where they're comfortable coming forward to begin with. That's it.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think one of the themes I've been hearing throughout today is just really that we need to not think, like we were saying before, about accommodations just for, being single-sided, or, people with disabilities or who are neurodiverse, but really, we all do better when we learn about these things, and when we implement best practices and try to improve and expand our awareness. Companies will have less turnover and better retention, and really benefit from the talent and high productivity of their workforce when they're feeling good and happy. So with that, I want to just share a quick do a quick screen share here with some key takeaways. Sorry, one second. Because there was so much information today, and so if you leave here with nothing else, I would love if those of us joining today could remember that transition education services and programs should be grounded in high quality research, especially on predictors of success and effective practices. That traditional interview processes can pose barriers for people with autism, and that employers, service providers, and job applicants can all play a role in reducing those barriers. And that all attempts to create neuro-inclusive workplaces should involve the neurodivergent community in some way. Flexibility, autonomy, and continued learning are key. And finally, get started in neuro-inclusion now at any organization by clarifying the expectations you have in your working dynamics. So with that, I'll say thank you. I want to thank everyone for joining. Many thanks to our speakers today. Again, to Lisa Yang for her generous support of this work. And please visit the Caro website and sign up for invitations to future webinars. So thank you all for joining today, and we'll see you next time.